I should have known my wedding day would be the moment they'd try to break me for good. But even as I slipped on the satin heels and pinned the veil to my dark curls that morning, I still clung to the lie that family, no matter how poisonous, couldn't truly ruin me if I didn't let them. My name is Marin Calloway. I was 28 years old, standing in a rented dressing suite above a crumbling church hall in Sheffield, England. Outside, the wind howled through the cracks in the stained glass windows as if to warn me. But I had already chosen this path. I had chosen Ben, sweet, steady Ben, who never once made me feel small. My heart raced every time I heard him laugh. He'd saved me, or at least he'd reminded me that maybe I didn't need saving after all. Yet even now, as I traced the outline of my reflection, I could hear the faint echoes of my mother's voice, sharp, dismissive. "Don't smile too wide, Marin. Your teeth are crooked." I adjusted my veil and closed my eyes. A moment of calm. Or so I thought. It began in the church lobby when my father pulled me aside. His suit smelled like stale cigars, and his breath carried last night's whiskey. "Look at you, parading around like you're something special. You'll never be more than you were born to be, Marin. Worthless." His words cut me so deep that my knees nearly buckled, but my father only smirked and tugged his tie loose. "Don't embarrass us today. Keep your mouth shut, and when the time comes, remember who paid for that dress." I wish I could tell you that his words shocked me, but they didn't. My family had never missed a chance to remind me that I was an obligation, an accident they were forced to drag along. Still, something inside me bristled as I walked down the aisle minutes later, clutching my bouquet so tight the stems cracked beneath my palms. Ben's eyes locked onto mine from the altar. For a moment, everything faded. The snickering cousins, the aunts whispering about how I'd never keep a man. Ben's smile steadied me. I reached him. He squeezed my trembling hands. "You're here. We're doing this," he whispered. We said our vows. We kissed. The world seemed to bloom in that instant, as if the universe had decided to grant me mercy. But mercy is fleeting when you're chained to people who take pleasure in your pain. The reception was held in the same hall where I'd spent half my childhood cleaning up after my parents' drunken brawls during charity events. The smell of old varnish and spilled wine clung to the air. I stood in the corner, watching my family circle the buffet like vultures. "So," my mother said as she approached, glass of cheap champagne in hand. Her lips curled into a half-smile that never reached her eyes. "You think you've escaped us? Think that ring makes you someone?" She leaned in, breath sweet with gin. "Just remember, when he leaves you, you'll come crawling back. We'll see what you're worth then." I bit the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted blood. I didn't answer her. I just turned away and tried to focus on the sound of Ben's laughter as he toasted with his friends across the hall. He didn't know the depths of their cruelty. Not yet. By the time the cake was cut, the air in the room felt electric with resentment. My cousin Leanne, drunk and careless, announced to everyone that I'd never finish my degree. "Marin's always been too lazy for that," she slurred, balancing her glass on the back of a chair. The whispers grew. "Did you hear? She only married him for the money. She'll ruin him. She's worthless. Always was." I felt the old burn in my chest, the familiar shame that came from decades of being told I was nothing. I excused myself, stepping out into the dim corridor where the night air slipped through the stone walls like a ghost. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from my assistant, Nora. "Call me. Urgent." I frowned. Nora never called unless it was something big. I dialed her back, my fingers trembling from the cold and the weight of the day. She picked up on the first ring. "Marin, you need to hear this now." "Nora, it's my wedding day," I hissed, glancing over my shoulder as my mother's shrill laughter echoed from the hall. "I know," she said, her voice low but fierce. "But you asked me to get the paperwork ready for that property? The one they're squatting in." My breath caught. I felt the first flicker of power in my veins, a warmth that pushed back against the ice they'd tried to bury me under for years. "Tell me." "It's done. I served them. They'll be evicted by the end of the month." For a moment, the corridor seemed to spin. The cracked plaster, the flickering light bulb overhead, The dull thud of bass from inside the hall. All of it faded into a silence so sweet it tasted like freedom. I turned toward the door, ready to step back into the den of wolves with a secret curled around my tongue like a blade. They'd called me worthless at my own wedding, but they didn't know what I'd been building behind their backs. And tonight they'd learn exactly how worthless I was. I pushed open the door, chin lifted high, my heart pounding not with fear, but with something I'd never felt at any family gathering before. Triumph. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. I stepped back into the reception hall like I was crossing a battlefield, because in a way, I was. My father's laughter boomed across the room as he leaned over the open bar, bragging about the success of marrying off his useless daughter. My mother perched like a queen on her throne of petty gossip, weaving stories that stained my name before the ink on my marriage certificate was even dry. But they didn't know. Not yet. They didn't know I'd spent every sleepless night for the last year building a life they couldn't touch. A life that, tonight, would crash down on their heads like a storm they never saw coming. I scanned the room until my eyes landed on Ben. He was laughing with his best man, oblivious to the poison circling me like sharks. His brown eyes found mine and he mouthed, "You okay?" I nodded. I was more than okay. For the first time in my life, I felt the crackle of power in my veins. I made my way toward the head table, dodging slurred congratulations and half-hearted hugs. My mother caught my arm as I passed. Her nails dug into my skin, a reminder that the queen always drew blood before she gave up the crown. "Where have you been, Marin?" Her voice was syrupy sweet for the onlookers. The bride shouldn't disappear on her own wedding day. "Just needed some air," I said, pulling my arm free. I caught a flash of confusion in her eyes. She knew that old, trembling Marin would have stayed and taken it. But this wasn't the same girl they'd spent years tearing apart. Ben raised his glass when I reached him. "Everything okay?" "Perfect," I said, pressing my lips to his cheek. His warmth anchored me. "Better than perfect." The music kicked up again. An old pop hit that everyone knew but pretended to hate. I danced with Ben, letting him spin me across the sticky floor, my laughter mixing with the clink of glasses and the hiss of whispered insults. Every glance from my family bounced off me like rain on armor. It didn't take long for them to corner me again. I slipped outside for another breath of freedom, but my father followed, his heavy boots crunching over the gravel path behind the hall. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" he snarled, flicking his cigarette onto the stones. "Marrying some fool who doesn't know what you really are." I turned, the veil slipping from my hair to hang loose around my shoulders. "And what am I, Dad?" His lip curled. "A leech. Always have been. You think a ring changes that? He'll find out. They always do." "Funny," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "I was just thinking the same thing about you." His brows drew together, the smirk replaced by a flicker of something I hadn't seen before. Fear. It suited him. I stepped closer, letting the silence stretch until he leaned back on instinct. "You're so sure you're the king of this family. So sure I'd always need you. But you needed me more than you ever admitted. And now you're about to lose everything." "What the hell are you talking about?" I smiled, a sharp, dangerous thing that felt foreign but good on my lips. "Enjoy the party, Dad. It's your last one in that house you love so much." I didn't wait for his answer. I slipped back inside, leaving him standing in the cold with nothing but his rage to keep him warm. The night stretched on. Dances, speeches, the uncomfortable shuffle of people trying to look supportive while feeding on the drama like it was wedding cake. My mother took her place at the mic when it was her turn for a toast. She tapped it once, the screech of feedback slicing through the hum of conversation. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, swaying slightly, "today we're here to celebrate our little Marin." A chorus of polite claps. "Our Marin," she repeated, eyes glinting like shards of glass. "Who's always been, well, a bit of a disappointment, if we're honest." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter. Ben's jaw tightened beside me, his hand finding mine under the table. "But look at her now," she continued, lifting her glass high. Married off to a man who hasn't yet figured out how much work he's got ahead of him. Bless his heart. The room tittered. I felt my cheeks flush, but I didn't look away. I wanted her to see me watching. Wanted her to know that this would be the last time she spoke over me without consequence. She prattled on about how she and my father gave up so much to raise me. How they hoped I'd finally make something of myself now that I had a good man to guide me. When she finally stumbled off the stage, the guests clapped out of obligation, their smiles tight and eyes darting anywhere but at me. Ben leaned close. "Do you want me to say something? Shut this down?" I squeezed his hand. "Not yet." He frowned but didn't press. He didn't know. He couldn't know. Not until it was done. Hours later, the crowd thinned. The DJ packed up. The last of the drunk uncles dragged their half-asleep wives out to waiting taxis. I stood by the door saying hollow goodbyes, my mind already racing through the details Nora had sent me. The eviction notice was ironclad. The paperwork traced every lie, every skipped rent, every forgery they'd used to keep that roof over their heads while calling me worthless. I could have told Ben that night, could have pulled him aside, spilled every detail about how my father forged my signature on loan documents, how my mother siphoned money from my student loans to pay for their gambling debts. But it wasn't time. I wanted them to feel the ground shift under their feet first, to hear the knocking on their door and realize, finally, that I wasn't theirs to break anymore. I went home with Ben, curling into his side in the back of the car as the driver took us to the small flat we'd rented until our new place was ready. He stroked my hair, humming under his breath. He thought he'd married the girl he'd met at the university library 3 years ago, the girl who never raised her voice, who apologized for existing. He'd learned soon enough that he'd married someone much stronger, someone reborn from spite and survival. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother's smirk, my father's sneer. I saw the keys to their house in my hand, the locks changed, their suitcases on the lawn. I smiled into the darkness. The next morning, I made the call. Nora answered on the first ring. "Did they get the notice?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "They did," she said. "Your father tried to threaten the bailiff. Didn't work. They have until the end of the month." I let out a slow breath. "Good. And the press?" "Ready whenever you are. You wanted this public, right?" "I want every nosy neighbor who called me trash to know exactly who the real parasites were," I said, my nails digging crescents into my palm. "Leak it." I could hear her grin. "Consider it done." When I hung up, Ben was standing in the doorway, watching me with a puzzled frown. "Everything okay?" I crossed to him, wrapping my arms around his neck. "Perfect," I said, pressing my lips to his. "Better than perfect." He kissed me back, but I felt the question in the tension of his shoulders. He'd see soon enough, and when he did, he'd know that the woman he married wasn't weak, wasn't worthless. She was a storm, and the world was about to drown in the flood she brought with her. In the days that followed, my parents called. Again and again. First it was the angry voicemails, screaming, threats, the same old venom they'd spat since I was a child. Then the messages turned to pleading. "Marin, please, you can't do this. We raised you. We gave you everything. Everything except love. Everything except respect. Everything except the freedom to breathe without permission." I blocked their numbers one by one. I changed the locks on every door they ever tried to wedge their way through. And still, they kept coming, like ghosts too stubborn to cross over. One morning, I opened my inbox to find a single email from my father. No subject line, just 3 words. "You'll regret this." I smiled, because regret was something I'd buried long ago, right next to the part of me that believed their lies. The day before the eviction, I stood on the sidewalk across from the house I'd grown up in. It was smaller than I remembered. Dingier. The garden overgrown. Paint peeling from the window frames like old scabs. Funny how the things you fear look so much smaller once you've outgrown them. A moving truck idled in the driveway. My father paced on the front step, barking into his phone, his face red with fury. My mother sat on the porch swing, her head in her hands. They didn't see me. And I didn't care if they did. I stayed just long enough to watch the bailiff post the final notice on the door. Then I turned away, the house shrinking behind me with every step. I walked down the street, the wind at my back, my spine straighter than it had ever been. They'd called me worthless at my own wedding. They'd tried to break me every chance they got. But now they had nothing, and I had everything I needed. I didn't look back, but I felt every step echo through me like a drumbeat. Each footfall a vow that I would never, ever let myself be dragged back into the pit they'd dug for me. It was almost funny, in a cruel sort of way, how my family had become the architects of their own ruin. Every insult, every slap of words against my skin, every night they made me feel like an empty vessel, worthless, disposable, had forged me into this. A woman who could stand on the cracked pavement across from the house that raised her and feel nothing but the thrill of freedom as it slipped out from under them. I walked until the house was gone from view, replaced by the row of broken brick terraces and the old iron streetlights flickering in the misty Sheffield morning. My phone buzzed again. Nora. Always Nora. Efficient and loyal in a way I'd never known loyalty could be. "Did you see it through?" she asked. No greeting necessary. "I did," I said, my voice hoarse. "They're packing up now." "Good," she said. A pause, then softer. "Are you okay?" I stood there, staring at a faded billboard advertising a family law firm. The irony made me want to laugh. "I don't know yet," I said. "But I will be." Ben called while I waited for the bus back to our flat. His voice was warm, sleepy, laced with that soft concern he couldn't hide. "Hey, where'd you run off to this morning?" "I woke up and you were gone." I glanced up at the slate-gray sky, the mist gathering on my lashes. "Just had something to take care of," I said. "I'll be home soon. Want me to pick up breakfast?" He paused. "Marin, I know you're not telling me everything." And I loved him for that. Loved that he could feel the thunder rolling just behind my ribs, and still trust me enough to let it break in my own time. "I'll tell you soon," I promised. "I just need a little more time." A beat of silence then. "Okay, I love you. Love you too." The bus came. I sank into a seat by the window, pressing my forehead to the cold glass as the city slid past. Graffiti-tagged walls, shuttered shops, a kid on a BMX who flipped me off when I accidentally made eye contact. I smiled. Sheffield was rough around the edges, but honest in a way my family had never been. You could see the broken parts, the cracks that let the cold in. No one pretended here. When I got home, Ben was waiting with 2 mugs of coffee and a plate of toast that was already going stale. He looked so out of place in our cramped kitchenette, his tall frame hunched, shoulders bunched up like he was bracing for bad news. He didn't ask. He just handed me my mug and kissed my forehead. That was Ben. No questions until I was ready. But that didn't mean the rest of the world would wait. By Monday, the story hit the local paper. Small headline, tucked between a car crash report and a piece on rising rent prices. Local couple evicted after years of fraud. There was a photo. My father, wild-eyed, pointing at the camera like he could reach through the lens and throttle the reporter. My mother half hidden behind him, hair in curlers, a plastic bag of cheap clothes dangling from her wrist. I read the piece twice. It barely scratched the surface, but it was enough. By noon, my inbox was a flood of messages from distant relatives, old neighbors, people I hadn't heard from in a decade. Half of them wanted to gloat, to gossip. The other half? To warn me. To tell me I'd gone too far. Too far, as if they hadn't spent my entire life dragging me down into their mess. As if they hadn't stolen every chance I had to breathe freely, to feel safe in my own skin. I hit delete on every message, blocking each number that dared tell me I owed my family forgiveness. Ben watched me, silent but watchful. That night as we lay in bed, he rolled onto his side and traced circles on my back with his thumb. "Is this why they hate you so much?" he asked, voice gentle. I turned my head on the pillow, meeting his eyes in the glow of the street lamp outside. "No," I said. They hate me because I survived them." His hand stilled. "What happens now?" "Now they find out what it's like to build something for themselves. Or they don't. Either way, they're not my problem anymore." He kissed my temple, pulling me closer. "And us?" "We build something better," I whispered into his chest. "Something they can't poison." But it's never that simple, is it? Families like mine don't just vanish. They slither into the cracks, slip back under doors you thought you'd bolted shut. And just when you think you're free, they remind you, blood ties are chains if you let them be. A week later, Nora called again. This time, her voice wasn't fierce or proud. It was wary. "Marin, you need to see this." She sent a link, a private Facebook group, family members, old neighbors, anyone who wanted a front row seat to my downfall. They'd turned my wedding photos into memes, cropped my face, wrote things like, "Look who thinks she's too good for the people who raised her. Wait until her husband finds out what she's really like." There were threats too. My father, using a cousin's account, bragging about how he'd come for me, that he'd ruin my marriage, turn Ben against me the way they'd always turned people against me when I was too young to defend myself. Nora's message pinged again. "Want me to take it down?" I stared at my smiling face, my wedding veil, the light in my eyes that they'd tried so hard to stamp out, and I felt a slow burn at the base of my spine. "No," I typed back. "Let them watch." The next day, I booked a meeting with a solicitor. Not just for the eviction, they were out, and the locks had been changed, but to bury the threat once and for all. I wanted restraining orders so tight they'd choke on them, if they so much as breathed in my direction. I wanted every old debt they'd run up in my name called due. And I wanted it all documented, public, undeniable, a testament to the girl they'd called worthless, who was now the woman who would not bend. The solicitor, a sharp-eyed woman named Claudia, raised an eyebrow as she flipped through the papers I laid out. "Most people don't want to escalate family matters," she said. "They're afraid of the backlash." I met her gaze head-on. "I've lived my whole life in backlash. I'm done pretending they deserve mercy." She smiled, thin but approving. "Good, let's finish this." When I got home, Ben was in the kitchen again, sleeves rolled up, chopping vegetables like he was training for a cooking show. He looked up, a question in his eyes. "I'm meeting with Claudia again tomorrow," I said, slipping my bag off my shoulder. "It's going to get messy." "Messier than it already is?" he asked, setting down his knife. "Marin, just tell me, what are you planning?" So I did. For the first time since that night in the corridor with Nora's call, I told him everything. The forged signatures. The loans. The years they'd leached off my credit, my savings. The house they claimed was theirs, but had always been legally mine. The same house they mocked me from, while I scraped together rent for tiny flats and instant noodles. When I finished, Ben didn't say anything. He just crossed the kitchen, pulled me into his arms, and held me so tight I could barely breathe. "I'm proud of you," he said against my hair. "I wish you didn't have to fight like this, but I'm so damn proud of you." And for the first time since the wedding, I let myself cry. Not the silent tears I used to swallow back so they wouldn't call me dramatic. Not the tears I used to hide behind locked bathroom doors. Real, shaking sobs that cracked me open and let the rot pour out. When the tears stopped, I felt lighter. Not healed. Not yet. But lighter. Ben wiped my cheeks with his thumbs and kissed my damp eyelids. "Let them talk," he whispered. "Let them try. They've already lost." And in that moment, I almost believed him. But even storms have an eye. A quiet, before the next wave hits. And as I drifted off that night, curled in the circle of his arms, I didn't yet know that the worst was still waiting. That my family's final desperate strike would come not from the shadows, but from a place so close I'd never see it coming. Too far, as if they hadn't spent my entire life dragging me down into their mess. As if they hadn't stolen every chance I had to breathe freely, to feel safe in my own skin. I hit delete on every message, blocking each number that dared tell me I owed my family forgiveness. Ben watched me, silent but watchful. That night as we lay in bed, he rolled onto his side and traced circles on my back with his thumb. "Is this why they hate you so much?" he asked, voice gentle. I turned my head on the pillow, meeting his eyes in the glow of the street lamp outside. "No," I said. "They hate me because I survived them." His hand stilled. "What happens now?" "Now they find out what it's like to build something for themselves. Or they don't. Either way, they're not my problem anymore." He kissed my temple, pulling me closer. "And us?" "We build something better," I whispered into his chest. "Something they can't poison." But it's never that simple, is it? Families like mine don't just vanish. They slither into the cracks, slip back under doors you thought you'd bolted shut. And just when you think you're free, they remind you, blood ties are chains if you let them be. A week later, Nora called again. This time, her voice wasn't fierce or proud. It was wary. "Marin, you need to see this." She sent a link, a private Facebook group, family members, old neighbors, anyone who wanted a front row seat to my downfall. They'd turned my wedding photos into memes, cropped my face, wrote things like, "Look who thinks she's too good for the people who raised her. Wait until her husband finds out what she's really like." There were threats too. My father, using a cousin's account, bragging about how he'd come for me, that he'd ruin my marriage, turn Ben against me the way they'd always turned people against me when I was too young to defend myself. Nora's message pinged again. "Want me to take it down?" I stared at my smiling face, my wedding veil, the light in my eyes that they'd tried so hard to stamp out, and I felt a slow burn at the base of my spine. "No," I typed back. "Let them watch." The next day, I booked a meeting with a solicitor. Not just for the eviction, they were out, and the locks had been changed, but to bury the threat once and for all. I wanted restraining orders so tight they'd choke on them, if they so much as breathed in my direction. I wanted every old debt they'd run up in my name called due. And I wanted it all documented, public, undeniable, a testament to the girl they'd called worthless, who was now the woman who would not bend. The solicitor, a sharp-eyed woman named Claudia, raised an eyebrow as she flipped through the papers I laid out. "Most people don't want to escalate family matters," she said. "They're afraid of the backlash." I met her gaze head-on. "I've lived my whole life in backlash. I'm done pretending they deserve mercy." She smiled, thin but approving. "Good, let's finish this." When I got home, Ben was in the kitchen again, sleeves rolled up, chopping vegetables like he was training for a cooking show. He looked up, a question in his eyes. "I'm meeting with Claudia again tomorrow," I said, slipping my bag off my shoulder. "It's going to get messy." "Messier than it already is?" he asked, setting down his knife. "Marin, just tell me, what are you planning?" So I did. For the first time since that night in the corridor with Nora's call, I told him everything. The forged signatures. The loans. The years they'd leached off my credit, my savings. The house they claimed was theirs, but had always been legally mine. The same house they mocked me from, while I scraped together rent for tiny flats and instant noodles. When I finished, Ben didn't say anything. He just crossed the kitchen, pulled me into his arms, and held me so tight I could barely breathe. "I'm proud of you," he said against my hair. "I wish you didn't have to fight like this, but I'm so damn proud of you." And for the first time since the wedding, I let myself cry. Not the silent tears I used to swallow back so they wouldn't call me dramatic. Not the tears I used to hide behind locked bathroom doors. Real, shaking sobs that cracked me open and let the rot pour out. When the tears stopped, I felt lighter. Not healed. Not yet. But lighter. Ben wiped my cheeks with his thumbs and kissed my damp eyelids. "Let them talk," he whispered. "Let them try. They've already lost." And in that moment, I almost believed him. But even storms have an eye. A quiet, before the next wave hits. And as I drifted off that night, curled in the circle of his arms, I didn't yet know that the worst was still waiting. That my family's final desperate strike would come not from the shadows, but from a place so close I'd never see it coming. The next morning dawned gray and restless, like the sky knew what I didn't. I lay awake long after Ben's breathing had settled into its soft rhythm, my mind a wheel spinning faster and faster, churning through every possibility of what they might do next. I'd taken the house, their last claim to stability. I'd ripped away the mask they wore for the neighbors, the friends who believed their lies about me for so long. I'd left them naked in the streetlight of the truth. But the worst kind of people, my kind of people, never accept defeat quietly. By the time Ben stirred, sunlight had crept across our duvet, warm but useless against the chill under my skin. He kissed my shoulder, murmuring something about breakfast, but I barely heard him. My phone was face down on the nightstand, vibrating every few minutes with new messages, blocked numbers, fake accounts, threats that made my stomach clench. Some were so vile they would have made me shrink back once. But not now. Now they only poured fuel on the fire. I sat up and read every word. I wanted to feel it all. The hate, the bile, the desperation. I wanted to carve it into my bones so that the next time they tried to tell me I owed them anything, I'd remember exactly who they were. When I walked into the kitchen, Ben was pouring tea, humming some old song his mum used to play on Sunday mornings. He looked up, smile ready to break across his face. But it faltered when he saw me. "What is it?" he asked. "No point lying now." "They're not done," I said, holding up my phone. "They're rallying everyone they can. Cousins, old family friends, anyone who'll listen." Ben set the teapot down with a soft clink. "What do you want to do?" It was such a simple question. But when you've spent your whole life with people who only asked what you could do for them, it felt like being handed the world. I sat across from him and pushed my hair behind my ears, the weight of the day pressing into my shoulders. "I want them to understand there's no coming back," I said. "No last-minute redemption arc. They need to know I'm not theirs to play with anymore." He reached for my hand, calloused fingers wrapping around mine. "Then let's finish it." I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes, because finishing it meant digging deeper than I ever had before. By noon, I was back at Claudia's office, the smell of old paper and fresh ink wrapping around me like armor. She spread out the documents I'd signed the week before, every line of credit they'd opened in my name, every utility bill they'd left unpaid, every debt I'd quietly cleared to keep my own credit from sinking. Each page was a testament to the years they'd siphoned me dry while insisting I owed them everything. "We can press charges," Claudia said, tapping her pen against the stack. "Fraud, identity theft, coercion. It's more than enough to make it stick." The words tasted sweet and sour all at once. I wanted justice, but I also knew the backlash would come like a tidal wave. I pictured my mother on the stand, crocodile tears glistening while she spun stories about the ungrateful daughter who abandoned her sick parents. I pictured my father's rage, the way he'd twist it into something ugly enough to sell to any gossip rag that would listen. "Do it," I said, my voice quiet but iron-wrapped. "No more running." Claudia nodded once, a glimmer of admiration in her eyes. "I'll handle the paperwork. But Marin, this will get messy. They'll come for you." "They already have," I said. "I'm still here." When I got home, Ben was waiting at the door. He'd left work early, some instinct telling him I shouldn't face the afternoon alone. He pulled me inside, wrapping me in his arms like he could shield me from the storm gathering at our doorstep. "Tell me it's done," he murmured into my hair. "Almost," I said. "They'll be served next week." He leaned back, his eyes searching mine. "And you?" "I'll be fine," I lied. Because the truth was, part of me wasn't sure. Part of me wondered if I'd built myself up so high that when they struck, I'd shatter in pieces too small to gather again. But Ben just kissed me, slow and steady, like a promise. "Whatever happens, I'm here." The days ticked by in a blur of paperwork and whispered threats. I started getting calls from unknown numbers. Journalists fishing for a soundbite, old school friends pretending to care while they recorded every word for the next family gossip session. I stopped answering altogether, leaving Nora to field the vultures while I focused on what mattered, closing every door they might pry open. It was Nora who called me at midnight 3 days later, her voice low and shaking in a way I'd never heard before. "Marin," she said, "you need to come to the office. Now." "Nora, it's the middle of the night." "What is it?" A pause. They broke in. I sat bolt upright in bed, the phone pressed so hard to my ear I felt the plastic cut into my skin. What? Who? Your parents, she hissed. Your father. He came here looking for the files. He trashed the place. I'm here with the police now, but you need to see this. Ben stirred beside me. What's wrong? I climbed out of bed, my hands shaking as I pulled on yesterday's jeans and a jumper from the laundry basket. They broke into the office, I said. They're trying to destroy the evidence. Ben was out of bed in a heartbeat, grabbing his keys. I'm coming with you. We drove through the dark city streets, streetlights streaking gold across the windscreen. My mind raced, 1,000 fears clawing at the edges. Would they come for us next? Would they drag Ben into this mess the way they dragged everyone else I'd ever cared about? When we arrived, the glass door to my tiny rented office was spider-webbed with cracks, a single swing away from shattering completely. Inside, files were strewn across the floor like confetti, shredded papers mixing with the spilled coffee and broken furniture. Nora stood in the middle of it all, arms crossed tight over her chest, eyes wild with fury. They thought they could find the originals, she spat when she saw me. They thought they could burn it all before you could press charges. Ben stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. Did they touch you? No, she said. I wasn't here yet, but the security cameras got everything. He's done, Marin. He's finished. I knelt down, gathering the shredded papers in my shaking hands. Years of my life, reduced to confetti by a man who'd rather see me ruined than let me go. My eyes burned, but no tears came. Not this time. I was so far beyond tears now. Nora, I said, my voice cracking like old ice. Get the footage to Claudia. I want him charged with breaking and entering, too. Everything. No mercy. You got it, she said. Let's bury him. When we got back to the flat, the sun was just cresting the horizon, turning the city rooftops gold. I stood by the window, watching the light creep over the bricks, the chimneys, the terraced houses that looked so pretty from a distance but hid so much rot inside. Ben came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. Hey, he said. Look at me. I turned. He brushed a strand of hair from my face, his eyes soft but fierce. They don't win this time. You hear me? They don't. I know, I said. Sometimes I wish I didn't have to keep fighting. Then we'll fight together, he said. Until there's nothing left to fight. His words sank deep into the hollow place inside me. The place that still wondered if maybe, just maybe, they'd find one more way to break me. But as I looked out at the waking city, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, they'd have to get through me first. I had spent my whole life being their scapegoat, their punching bag, their excuse. Not anymore. The knock at the door came 3 days later. Not the police, not another neighbor asking questions. This time, it was my mother. She stood on my doorstep, hair done up in her best curls, her lips painted in that too red lipstick she always wore when she wanted to play the martyr. Behind her, my father loomed like a shadow, arms crossed, eyes glinting with the promise of violence. Marin, she said, her voice dripping with honey. Can we come in? We need to talk. I looked at Ben, who shook his head almost imperceptibly, but I stepped aside anyway. I needed to hear what they'd say when they realized the empire they'd built on my back was finally crumbling into dust. They sat on my sofa like they owned it, like they owned me. My mother's eyes darted around, lingering on the photos of Ben and me on the mantel, the neat stack of files on the coffee table. Evidence of a life they no longer had any part in. You don't have to do this, my mother said, leaning forward. We're family, Marin. We can fix this. I almost laughed. Fix what? All of this. She gestured around like my entire life was an inconvenience to be tidied up. We can pay you back. We can work something out. You don't have to ruin us. My father's lip curled. Listen to your mother. You want to air our dirty laundry to the whole world? You want everyone to see what a selfish little... Stop, I said, the word cutting through his tirade like a blade. You don't get to stand in my home and call me that. Not anymore. He glared at me, but I held his gaze until he looked away. A small, hard victory, but it tasted sweeter than any apology they could ever fake. You want mercy? I asked. You want me to walk away from the charges? They nodded, too eager. I saw it then, the fear under the bravado, the dread of losing the last scraps of their image, their safety net. Then here's the deal, I said, my voice cold enough to freeze the sun. You sign over every right, every claim you think you have on me, you stay away. You don't call, you don't write, you don't show up on my doorstep pretending to be the parents you never were. You disappear. My mother's eyes widened. And if we don't? Then I bury you, I said. Legally, financially, publicly. I won't rest until everyone knows exactly what you are. They sat there, stunned into silence by the daughter they'd once called worthless. And for the first time, they looked at me not like their possession, but like the force of nature I'd become. My parents didn't move for a long moment, frozen on my sofa like they'd been carved from old stone, cracked and crumbling, but still clinging to the belief they could intimidate me back into submission. I almost pitied them for that. Almost. My father finally spoke, his voice low and ragged, like gravel dragged across my childhood. You'd really do this? To your own flesh and blood? Flesh and blood, I repeated, tasting the words like poison on my tongue. Is that what you call it? What did you ever give me that wasn't soaked in strings and threats? My mother's lower lip trembled, the performance she'd perfected so many times before. Her eyes darted to Ben, who stood just behind me like an immovable wall of warmth and iron. She must have hoped he'd take pity, that he'd see a fragile old woman instead of the venom coiled just beneath her skin. But Ben didn't flinch. His hand found the small of my back, a simple touch that grounded me more than any vow ever could. Don't do this, Marin, she whispered. You'll ruin everything. No, I said, voice steady, sure. You ruined everything. I'm just done pretending you didn't. My father leaned forward, his eyes hard and gleaming. You think this is over? You think some piece of paper will keep us away? You're ours, Marin. You always will be. A tremor ran down my spine, but I didn't let it show. I'd lived through their storms before. I knew how to stand in the eye of it now. Sign the papers, I said, my tone final, or watch it all burn. My mother opened her mouth, but my father silenced her with a flick of his hand. His glare lingered on Ben, as if weighing whether he could still tear him away from me somehow. But Ben didn't even blink. He just squeezed my hand, a quiet promise that I wasn't alone anymore. After what felt like a century, my father stood. You think you're strong now, he spat. But you'll come crawling back, you always do. Not this time, I said, meeting his glare with a calm I didn't even know I had. And next time you show up here, the police will be waiting. They left in a flurry of rustling coats and cold air, the door slamming so hard it rattled the frames on the wall. I stood there, staring at the empty space they'd occupied, the silence ringing in my ears like a bell struck too hard. Ben turned me to face him, his thumb brushing my cheek. You okay? No, I said honestly, but I will be. He smiled, soft but fierce. Damn right you will. We spent the rest of the night on the sofa, wrapped in blankets, the telly humming in the background, but neither of us really watching. My mind replayed every word, every threat, every half smile that had masked their desperation. I knew they'd sign. They had no choice now. Not with the eviction, the fraud, the break-in. They'd pushed every limit until the ropes snapped back around their own throats. At some point, I must have drifted off, because the next thing I knew, dawn was spilling across the living room, pale and hesitant. Ben was snoring softly beside me, his head tilted back, one arm still draped protectively around my shoulders. I untangled myself, careful not to wake him, and padded to the kitchen, The kettle hissed, steam curling around my face as I stared at my reflection in the dark window. My eyes looked tired, older than they should have at 28. But there was something else there too. Something new, a steel spine under the scars. My phone buzzed on the counter, snapping me back to the moment. A message from Nora. They signed. It's done. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. It was over. Legally, anyway. The chains they'd wrapped around my throat since I was a child had finally been severed by ink and paper. But freedom, I was learning, isn't a light switch. It's a door you keep having to push open every day, sometimes with your whole body. And some mornings, the weight of it almost makes you want to crawl back into the cage, you know. I made tea and crept back to the sofa, curling up beside Ben. He stirred, blinking at me with those sleepy eyes that always made me feel like maybe the world wasn't all sharp edges and broken glass. They signed, I said. His smile was slow, warm. Told you they would. He pulled me into his arms again, my head tucked under his chin, and for a while, we just sat there, letting the quiet wrap around us like a promise. But freedom is never free. The calls didn't stop. The private Facebook group was still buzzing like a nest of hornets. Distant relatives, people I barely remembered from Christmas dinners when I was 5, took sides. Some called me a monster. Others wanted to know how they could do the same thing, as if I'd been hoarding the secret to surviving a toxic family all along. I ignored most of it, blocked numbers, changed passwords, tightened every digital door they could slip through. But some nights, when Ben was asleep and the city outside our window hummed with life I couldn't touch, I'd scroll through the comments just to feel the old wound throb, just to remind myself why I'd done it. One night, an email landed in my inbox that made my blood run cold. An anonymous burner address. No subject line, just 2 lines. You think this is over. It's not. I read it a dozen times. I could picture my father behind it, or one of his cronies. But the part that chilled me the most was that tiny voice in the back of my head that whispered, "What if they're right?" Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. The next morning, I called Claudia. Can we trace it? She sighed. If they were stupid enough to use an unprotected connection, maybe. But Marin, you've done everything right. Legally, they can't touch you now. Let it go. But I couldn't. I knew them. I knew how they burrowed into the cracks you didn't even know you had. How they waited for you to feel safe before they pounced again. So I went on the offensive. I hired a security company to sweep our flat. Cameras, motion sensors, new locks on every door and window. Ben didn't protest. He just stayed up with me every night, reading the contracts line by line, making sure no detail could slip through the net. I watched the money drain from my account. Savings I'd spent years building, gone in weeks. But every penny felt like armor. I'd rather be broke and safe than rich, and waiting for the next blow. It was Nora who found the leak. A distant cousin, one I'd barely spoken to since we were kids, had been feeding my father information. Where I lived. Where Ben worked. The routes we walked every Sunday to the farmer's market. The things you share with family because you think blood means loyalty. I confronted him in a greasy spoon cafe on the edge of town. He was older now, hairline retreating, belly pushing against the buttons of his cheap shirt. He smiled when he saw me, like we were kids again, and he hadn't just put a target on my back for a handful of hush money. Why? I asked, my tea untouched, the steam curling between us like a ghost. He shrugged. Your dad said you owed him, said you were ruining everything. He just wanted to know you were okay. Don't lie to me, I said, my voice so cold I watched the smile slip off his face like melted wax. He leaned back, eyes darting around the cafe. He said if I didn't help, he'd come for me too. Said you were rich now. Said you'd share if you really cared. The laugh that burst out of me startled the old couple in the booth behind us. Rich? Is that what he told you? I'm not rich. I'm free. There's a difference. He flinched like I'd slapped him. Marin? I stood, dropping a tenner on the table. You made your choice. Don't ever come near me again. And if you talk to him, tell him next time. I won't just call the police. I'll bury him. I walked out into the cold afternoon, the wind biting at my cheeks, my pulse racing so fast I thought I'd choke on it. I pulled out my phone and called Ben. "Hey," he answered, that soft warmth threading through my chest like stitches pulling me back together. "Pack a bag," I said. "We're going away for a while." We left the city behind before the sun had fully risen. The sky a bruise of lavender and gray, streaked with the promise of a storm that hadn't yet broken. Ben drove while I stared out the window, the hum of the engine and the rhythm of the road a lullaby that kept my thoughts from spiraling too far into the dark. Every mile felt like peeling off a layer of skin that had grown too tight, too scarred to breathe beneath. We didn't have a destination. That was the point. No forwarding address. No Facebook check-ins. No photos for the family to track through the web of people they still thought they owned. Just the two of us and the open road. Each passing town a fleeting glimpse of lives we'd never have to explain. We ended up in a coastal village 3 hours from Sheffield. Salt air and seagulls. Narrow streets that twisted around weathered cottages and tiny shops selling more trinkets than essentials. The guest house we found was run by an elderly woman named Eileen, who didn't ask questions when I paid in cash and used only my first name. "You two look like you've come a long way," she said as she handed over the key, her eyes sharp but kind. "Sometimes you just need to breathe somewhere they can't follow, EH." "Exactly that," I said. Ben squeezed my hand under the counter, a silent agreement. The room was small, just a creaky double bed, and a wardrobe that smelled faintly of mothballs and lavender. But the window opened onto the sea, and the wind carried the salt into our lungs like a promise of cleansing. We lay on that bed for hours, shoes still on, holding each other in the hush between what we'd left behind and what might come next. But peace is fragile when you've been raised inside a war zone. I woke in the middle of the night, tangled in sweat-soaked sheets, my heart galloping like I'd heard a door slam or footsteps in the hall. Ben stirred, pulling me close, whispering, "You're safe. It's just us." The next day, I sat on the beach while Ben walked to the village shop for bread and milk. The wind whipped my hair across my face, and I let it sting, a reminder that I was alive, that I was here. Every day away from them felt like learning how to be a person again, one small, shaky step at a time. I called Nora from a payphone, tucked behind a chipped blue kiosk. "We're safe," I told her. "Stay on top of the paperwork. If they even breathe in my direction, I want to know." "They haven't tried yet," she said. "But your father's been asking questions. He's using your cousin to sniff around. He thinks you'll cave if you run out of money." I barked a laugh that startled a passing seagull. They never understood, did they? I'd sleep in a doorway before I'd crawl back to them. "Marin," Nora said, voice softer now, "they're losing. But people like that, they don't lose well." I knew she was right. And yet, sitting on that cold sand, the sea roaring at my feet, I felt something that tasted dangerously like hope. For a week, we stayed hidden. Eileen kept our secrets. Her knowing smile and endless tea refills a balm for the raw edges that still bled if I looked too closely. Ben and I talked about stupid things. His old rugby mates, the dog we'd adopt one day, maybe two if we could handle the chaos. It felt normal. Almost. But normal doesn't last when the past has claws. On the 8th day, I walked into the village shop to find a note pinned to the community board by the entrance. A photo of me from the wedding, printed from some grainy screenshot. The words scribbled over my face in thick black marker. "Where's our money, Marie?" Not even my real name. Just another reminder that to them I was never really a person. Just a thing they could twist and rename and bend until I broke. I tore the paper down, my hands shaking. The shopkeeper, a hunched old man with a hearing aid that squealed when he turned, watched me with wary eyes. "Trouble?" he asked. "Not for you," I said, crumpling the note into my pocket. "I'm sorry if anyone asked questions." He shrugged. "People always come round here asking questions. Not my business. But you be careful, love. Bad men don't care how far you run." I nodded, my throat too tight to reply. Back at the guest house, Ben found me on the bed, The note opened between us. His face went still, hard in a way that made me remember he'd grown up in his own brand of chaos. He knew what it meant to fight for your life when no one was watching. "We need to call Claudia," he said. "I already did," I said. "She's tracing it. And I want Nora to find out who they paid this time." "Do you want to leave?" he asked. "We can go further, abroad if we have to." For a heartbeat, I considered it Spain, maybe, or Ireland, somewhere with cliffs and wild seas where they couldn't find me. But I felt something else too. The heat rising in my chest, the anger that had carried me this far. "No," I said. "I'm done running. They want a war? I'll give them one." That night, I sat at the rickety desk in our tiny room, the salt air rattling the window. I made lists. People to call, accounts to lock down, statements to prepare for the police. Ben lay on the bed, reading through my old files, the ones that mapped out every penny they'd siphoned over the years. "They'll hate you for this," he said quietly, not looking up. "They already do," I said. He closed the folder, meeting my eyes. "Good, then make them afraid too." When dawn came, I was ready. We packed our things before breakfast. Eileen watched us with sad eyes as we handed back the key. "Are you sure you won't stay?" she asked. "Sometimes peace is just choosing not to fight." I smiled, pressing her hand between mine. "Sometimes. But not this time." She pulled me in for a hug that smelled of lavender and old books. "Well, if you ever need to breathe again, you know where to find me." We drove back to Sheffield with the windows down, the wind tangling my hair, my mind a storm of plans and possibilities. Every mile closer felt like slipping back into the ring, fists wrapped, jaw set, ready to finish what I'd started. When we reached the city, Nora was waiting at our new flat, a nondescript building tucked behind rows of identical brick houses. She was pacing the pavement, a folder clutched to her chest. "They've been busy," she said as soon as I stepped out of the car. "They're trying to flip your story, telling everyone you stole from them, that you forged the papers, not the other way around." I laughed, a bitter edge slicing through it. "Of course they are. Parasites can't stand sunlight." Ben unloaded our bags in silence, his eyes scanning the street for any sign we'd been followed. I could feel it too, the shift in the air, the invisible thread that told me they were still out there, watching, waiting for a crack to slip through. Inside, Nora spread the files across our tiny kitchen table. "We have to go public," she said. "Tell your side before they do." "I know," I said. "Do you have the statements?" She nodded. "Press conference, local reporters, and the financial records, bank statements, the old loan documents, everything." Ben leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "It'll be ugly. They'll drag you through the mud." I looked at him, really looked. At the man who'd chosen me despite the mess, who'd stood by me when it would have been easier to run. "Let them," I said. "They can try, but I'm not the same girl they raised to stay silent." I spent the next 2 days rehearsing. Nora grilled me like a prosecutor, poking holes in every answer until I could say the truth, backwards and forwards, without flinching. Ben sat through it all, making sure I ate, making me laugh when my voice broke from exhaustion. When the day came, we stood outside the solicitor's office, the press waiting like crows on a wire. Cameras clicked. Microphones bobbed toward my face. I could feel my heartbeat in my teeth, the cold sweat down my back. But when I stepped forward, I felt weightless. "I know what you've heard," I said, my voice carrying over the hush that settled around us. "I know the stories they're telling, but this is the truth." I told them everything. The forged signatures, the unpaid debts, the years of gaslighting and manipulation, the eviction, the break-in, the threats. I didn't sugarcoat it. I didn't flinch when the questions came sharp and fast. When I finished, the silence was heavy. Cameras still clicked, but no one spoke. For the first time, they saw me. Not the broken girl they'd whispered about at family weddings, but the woman who had torn the lies apart with her bare hands. Afterwards, Ben wrapped me in his coat, pressing his lips to my temple. "You were brilliant," he said. "I was honest," I said. "That's enough." But even as the reporters scattered, their questions still echoing in the chill afternoon air, I felt the storm shifting again. They'd try to spin it, twist it, make me the villain in their bedtime stories. But I wasn't running anymore. Let them come. I was ready. I stood on the courthouse steps long after the reporters had packed up their cameras and driven away to hunt the next scandal. Ben's coat hung heavy on my shoulders, the collar turned up against the chill, but I barely felt the cold. I was still humming with adrenaline, my heartbeat drumming in my palms, my teeth buzzing with the words I'd just thrown into the world, like stones through stained glass. Beside me, Ben squeezed my hand. "They'll come for you harder now," he said, voice low enough that only I could hear. "I know," I said. And I did. I could already feel it in my bones. The shift in the air that meant my parents would be gathering every scrap of poison they could find, every rumor they could twist into a noose. But it didn't scare me anymore. If they wanted war, they'd have to drag me out of the fortress I'd built brick by bloody brick. We walked down the steps together, our footsteps echoing in the empty courtyard. Nora was waiting by the car, her phone already buzzing with new messages. "The story's spreading," she said, scrolling so fast her thumb was a blur. "Local sites, national tabloids. Some are spinning it, but most people are on your side. They love a woman who fights back." "Good," I said, sliding into the passenger seat. "Let them see every crack. I've got nothing left to hide." But that wasn't entirely true. There was still the part of me that flinched when I heard footsteps behind me in the dark. The part that saw my father's shadow stretching across my bedroom wall at night. The whisper of my mother's voice in my ear, telling me I'd never be free of them. For the next week, the story stayed alive like a fire no one could smother. My parents tried. God, did they try? They went on local radio shows, called in favors with the same neighbors they'd gossiped with, over cheap wine and stolen cigarettes for decades. They painted me as ungrateful, vindictive, mentally unstable. I saw the headlines. Daughter evicts aging parents, family drama turns ugly, the ungrateful bride. I could have hidden. Could have shut it all down, disappeared again with Ben to some seaside town where no one knew my name. But instead, I sat in our tiny flat, with the blinds drawn halfway, and watched every interview, read every article. I wanted to feel it all, to see exactly how low they'd go. And when they crossed the line, I was ready. They found Ben's parents first. A knock on their door late at night, my father standing on the front step, eyes bloodshot, voice dripping with false remorse. He told them I was unstable, that I'd stolen money from him and framed him for the fraud, that Ben would lose everything if he stayed with me. Ben's mum rang him before my father even made it off the driveway. Her voice trembled with worry, but she didn't waver. "We know who you married, love. You come stay with us if you need to." Ben hung up, his jaw clenched so tight I thought it might crack. "He thinks he can scare me off," he spat. "He doesn't know who the hell he's dealing with." "He's desperate," I said. "That's when he's most dangerous." We spent that night side by side at the kitchen table, Nora on speakerphone, while we mapped out our next move. Every threat they made, every lie they told, we documented it all. Police reports, lawyers' letters, cease and desist orders that read like war drums. "If he shows up again, you press charges for harassment," Claudia said when I called her the next morning. "You've got enough now to bury him in court if you have to." "He'll push it further," I said. "He always does." Claudia hesitated. "Then you push back harder." I hung up and stared at the stack of paperwork on the counter. It looked so harmless, just paper and ink. But it was the difference between freedom and another lifetime in his cage. Days turned into weeks. The story cooled down in the press, replaced by fresher scandals and flashier heartbreaks. But behind closed doors, the war smoldered. My father called from burner phones, leaving voicemails that veered from weeping apologies to snarled threats. My mother wrote letters in shaky handwriting, begging for forgiveness before slipping in lines like hooks. If you'd just come home, none of this would have happened. One night, Ben found me sitting in the hallway, my back against the door, the latest letter crumpled in my fist. "They're not worth it," he said, crouching down in front of me. "You know that, right?" "I know," I whispered, "but they're still in my head." He took my hands, peeling my fingers open one by one until the letter fell to the floor. "Then let's get them out." The next morning, I went to the bank and closed every account they'd ever had access to, changed passwords, moved my savings into a trust they couldn't touch, even if they sold their souls to the devil. I cut the final thread they'd used to tie me to them. A week later, the final blow came not from my father, but from the one person I hadn't expected, my mother's sister, Aunt June. She'd always been the quiet one, the one who slipped me biscuits under the table when my parents weren't looking, who slipped me cash and birthday cards with a wink. I thought she was different, better, but when I opened the door to find her standing there, wringing her hands in that nervous way she always did, I knew. "Don't do this," she pleaded. "Your mom's sick with worry. Your dad's a mess. They're losing everything, Marin. You can stop this." "Why would I?" I asked, my voice calm even as my insides twisted. "They did this to themselves." "They're still your parents," she said, voice breaking. "Blood's thicker than what?" I snapped. "Than fraud? Than violence? Than years of lies?" She flinched, tears pooling in her eyes. "You don't understand. You were always the strong one. They didn't know how to handle you." I laughed then, a sound so sharp it made her step back. "That's what you tell yourself so you can sleep at night, that you were just keeping the peace. You knew. You always knew." "Please," she whispered. "If you don't forgive them, what does that make you?" "Free," I said. "It makes me free." I shut the door before she could answer. I stood there for a long time, forehead pressed to the cool wood, the weight of her disappointment sliding off me like an old coat I should have shed years ago. Ben found me there, his hand on my shoulder. "You did the right thing," he said. "I know," I said. "I just wish it didn't feel like losing something I never really had." We spent the next few days cleaning house, blocking numbers, forwarding every letter to Claudia, shutting down the last whispers of my parents' smear campaign. When the final restraining order came through, it felt anticlimactic. A piece of paper, signed and stamped, saying they could never come near me again. I held it in my hands like a relic, proof that the girl they'd called worthless had written her own ending. But even then, some nights, I'd wake up gasping from dreams where my father's shadow loomed in the doorway, where my mother's voice dripped poison into my ear. Ben would pull me back to him, his arms strong around my ribs, his heartbeat a drum that reminded me I wasn't there anymore. I was here, with him, safe. One morning, I stood at the window as the sun rose over the city I'd once hated for how it trapped me. Now it looked different, still rough, still cracked in places, but honest in a way I'd come to love. I thought about the girl I'd been at that wedding, standing in the hallway with her phone buzzing in her palm, the word worthless echoing in her bones. I thought about how she'd answered that call anyway, how she'd pressed her back against the door and whispered, "Tell me, tell me." I thought about the woman I was now, and I knew. They'd never break me again. Not because they couldn't, but because I'd built something they could never touch. A life on my own terms, a love they could never poison. Ben stepped behind me, pressing his lips to my shoulder. "You ready to start over?" he asked. "I already have," I said, leaning into him. "I already have." I stepped away from the window as the sun climbed higher, pouring gold across the rooftops that had once felt like prison bars. The city hummed awake, traffic groaning through narrow streets, shop shutters clattering open. Once, every sound of this place had felt like a reminder of how small I was, how tightly my parents' hands clutched my throat, even when they weren't in the room. Now those same sounds made me feel rooted, alive, unreachable finally, in a way they'd never understand. Ben brewed coffee while I sat on the battered old sofa Nora had helped us move in. We'd made a life here from mismatched pieces, second-hand shelves, chipped mugs, a table that rocked if you leaned on it wrong. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. Free of them, the final restraining order had come through 2 days before. Claudia had called me just after I'd poured myself a glass of wine. "You're done, Marin," she'd said. "You're really done. They can't touch you now. Not legally, not financially, nothing." It should have felt like a finish line, the end of the marathon I'd been running since childhood. But instead, the silence of it had felt deafening, like the world had gone too still, like the echoes of their voices had nowhere left to land but inside my own head. Ben handed me a cup and sat beside me, legs bumping mine. "You want to talk about it?" I shook my head, watching the steam curl up from my drink. I don't know what to say anymore. It's like I built my whole life on fighting back, and now there's nothing left to fight. He tucked his arm around my shoulders, pulling me against his side. "Then maybe it's time to figure out what you want to build instead." That was the thing, wasn't it? You spend your whole life clawing your way out of the dark, and no one tells you what to do with the light when you finally find it. The next few days were quieter than I expected. No knocks at the door. No letters slipped under the mat. Nora called every morning to report that my father had retreated to his cousin's tiny flat across town, his pride too bruised to admit he'd lost. My mother, Nora said, was staying with June, whispering her version of the story to anyone who'd listen, still trying to spin the ending in her favor. "Let her talk," I told Nora one morning. "I'm done caring who believes her," and I meant it, mostly. But there were moments, standing in the supermarket queue, overhearing a stranger say my name like a curse, feeling that old flicker of shame. It still crept in at the edges sometimes, but it didn't root itself so deep anymore. Now it passed like a cold wind. Now I knew how to close the door against it. One evening, Ben and I sat on the floor, a pizza box balanced between us, the telly playing some old detective show we both half-watched. He tore off a slice and said, "Let's talk about the house." My hands froze around my glass. "What house?" "The one we're going to buy," he said, like it was obvious. "We can't stay in this flat forever, Marin. We've been saving for it." I swallowed, my chest tight. "I don't know if I can. I don't want to own walls that feel like cages again." He put down his pizza, leaned forward, eyes steady on mine. "Then let's find walls that feel like home instead. Somewhere no one's name is on the deed but ours. Somewhere they couldn't come knocking. Somewhere their shadows couldn't slither under the doorframe at night." The idea terrified me, but it thrilled me too. "You'd really do that?" I asked. "Buy a house with me after all this?" "Especially after all this," he said. "You survived them. So did I, in my own way. Let's build something they can't touch." We spent the next week driving around the edges of Sheffield, dipping into little towns with tree-lined streets and stone cottages older than our grandparents. Every house we toured, I saw ghosts in the corners. My father's sneer by the fireplace. My mother's voice dripping poison in the kitchen. But Ben's hand in mine anchored me back to the present, to the possibility of what we could make instead. One morning we found it. A narrow, terraced house with ivy climbing the bricks. A garden just big enough for wildflowers. And maybe, one day, a scruffy dog. The owner was a retired teacher, her eyes soft as she showed us the crooked floors and the creaking stairs. "It's not perfect," she said, "but it's been loved." That word caught in my throat like a thorn. Loved. What did I know about that? But when Ben squeezed my hand, I realized maybe I'd been learning all along. We signed the offer that afternoon, my signature trembling but firm at the bottom of the page. Nora threw us a party in her tiny flat that night. Cheap champagne, mismatched glasses, music so loud the neighbors banged on the walls. I danced barefoot in the kitchen, Ben's hands on my waist, his laugh warm against my ear. "This is it," he said. "This is the start." But even starts come with shadows. A week before the move, my phone buzzed while I was packing books into a battered old box. A number I didn't recognize. For a second, my heart stuttered. Another reporter? Another cousin? Another threat? But when I answered, the voice was soft, familiar. It took me a heartbeat to place it. "June." "Marin," she said, "I need to see you." "No," I said immediately. "We've been through this." Please, she whispered. I'm not here for them, I swear it. It's about your mother. The ache in her voice made something twist inside me. What about her? She's sick, Marin. Really sick. The doctors. Her breath hitched. She's asking for you. I could have hung up. Should have. But the weight of that word, mother, still pressed into me in ways I hated to admit. I'll think about it, I said, and ended the call before she could say more. Ben found me sitting on the floor, the phone still clutched in my hand like a stone. What is it? He asked. My mother, I said. She's dying. She wants to see me. He didn't try to push me either way. He just sat down beside me, his shoulder warm against mine, his silence the only answer I needed. For 3 days, I turned it over in my mind like a blade. Part of me wanted to walk away, to let her fade into the shadows she'd woven for herself. But another part, the small, fragile part that still craved something like closure, needed to look her in the eye one last time, not to forgive, not to forget, but to reclaim every piece of myself she'd tried to swallow whole. On the morning I decided, I stood in our empty new living room, the smell of fresh paint and old wood mixing in the dawn light. Ben touched my cheek, kissed my forehead. Do what you need to do, but don't let her take any more than she already has. I drove alone. The hospice was a squat brick building on the edge of the city, tucked between a petrol station and a half-built housing estate. I stood outside her door for a long time, my fingers brushing the frame, the hum of machines leaking through the thin walls. She looked small when I stepped inside, smaller than I'd ever seen her. The woman who had towered over me all my life, all sharp edges and venom, now just bones wrapped in a faded blanket. Her eyes flickered open when she heard my footsteps. Marin, she rasped. Her voice was softer than I remembered. You came. I stood at the foot of the bed, my arms crossed tight over my chest. What do you want? She coughed, a wet rattle that made me want to look away, but I didn't. I wanted to see you. I wanted to say I'm sorry. I almost laughed, but the sound got stuck in my throat. Sorry? For what? Her eyes fluttered shut for a moment, a single tear sliding down her temple. For all of it. For being what I was. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But as I looked at her, this shell of a woman who had once held so much power over my every breath, I felt something loosen in my chest. Not forgiveness. Not even understanding. Just release. I hope you find peace, I said. I really do, but you won't find it in me. I turned and walked out before she could say another word. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I drove home with the windows down, the wind tangling my hair, my chest aching with something that felt like freedom and grief all tangled up together. Ben was waiting on the front step of our new house, his arms open, his eyes soft and fierce all at once. I sank into him, my face pressed against his neck, breathing him in like air. It's done, I whispered. It's really done. And for the first time, I believed it. The house felt different when I stepped back inside. Warmer somehow, despite the fresh paint and the faint smell of plaster dust still clinging to the corners. Ben stood in the hallway, his arms open like he'd been waiting at that door since the second I drove away. And maybe, in his own way, he had. I dropped my bag on the floor, pressed my forehead to his chest, and let the world slip away for a moment. His hand found the back of my neck, gentle and steady, grounding me in the here and now. Did you get what you needed? He asked against my hair. I thought about my mother's eyes, glazed with morphine and regret, about the apology that had tasted hollow even as she said it. I don't know if I got what I needed, I said. But I got enough. We unpacked boxes late into the night, the rooms filling with echoes of our laughter, the occasional curse when we stumbled over a loose floorboard or dropped a mug we'd meant to keep forever. Each scrape and bump felt like a blessing, evidence that we were here, together, building something with our own hands, no strings attached. By dawn, the living room looked almost like a home. Books lined the shelves we'd rescued from the charity shop. The second-hand sofa sagged in the middle but felt like a throne under our tired bodies. We sat side by side, legs tangled under a patchwork blanket, watching the sun crawl up the walls. "She's gone now," I said softly. "It feels bigger than I thought it would." Ben brushed his thumb along my knuckles. "You're allowed to feel that. Doesn't mean you owe her anything more." "I know," I whispered, and for once, I did. But the world doesn't pause when your ghosts finally drift away. Bills still needed paying. The mailbox still coughed up letters from strangers who thought they knew our story better than we did. Some days, I'd open one and find the same venom I'd grown up swallowing whole. Anonymous lines scrawled in shaky handwriting. "You ruined your family. How could you do that to your own mother?" I'd stand by the bin and shred them one by one, each slice of the blade through paper like cutting another chain I hadn't even realized I still wore. Ben never said anything when he saw me do it. He just stood behind me, hands on my shoulders, silent and solid. Nora came by every week, her arms loaded with paperwork and takeaway curry. "Your father's still poking around," she'd say, flipping through the stack of reports like a dealer with a worn deck of cards, trying to find anyone who'll listen. But no one cares anymore. He burned every bridge. "Good," I said, and I meant it. But sometimes, late at night, I'd lie awake beside Ben and feel that old fear stir in my gut, the one that said they'd always find a way back in. The one that whispered I'd never be more than their puppet, strings or no strings. But then morning would come. Ben's warmth would seep into my bones, and I'd remember I was free because I chose to be. And freedom, I was learning, wasn't something you won once. It was something you fought for every day you woke up and decided not to let the past own you. One afternoon, I found myself standing at the kitchen window, watching our new neighbor hang laundry in her garden. She had 2 kids, both blonde whirlwinds of laughter and skinned knees, and a dog that barked at everything that moved. She looked up and caught my eye, waving her peg in the air like we'd been friends for years. I went out to say hello. We talked about the weather, the broken fence between our gardens, the best places to get cheap groceries. She asked nothing about my family. Didn't prod for gossip. Didn't care about the scandal that still haunted my name in old pub whispers. She just asked if I wanted to come over for tea sometime. I said yes. And when I stepped back into the house, the weight in my chest felt lighter than it had in years. A month passed, then another. Life grew into itself like ivy on the old brick walls. Messy, tangled, but alive. I found a job at a local charity shop, sorting boxes of donated clothes and cracked teacups. The hum of the radio in the background like a heartbeat I hadn't known I missed. It wasn't glamorous, it didn't make the headlines, but every shift reminded me I was more than the daughter they'd branded worthless. I was useful. Needed. Part of something that didn't demand my soul as payment. Ben's job stayed steady too. He'd come home smelling of sawdust and sweat. His smile a promise that the world could be simple sometimes. We'd sit on the back steps with mugs of tea, our knees touching, talking about nothing and everything until the stars came out. Sometimes, though, the past slipped through the cracks. I'd get a message from an old cousin, some veiled attempt at dragging me back into the pit. "We're family, Marin. Blood is thicker. You can't erase us." I'd block the number, delete the message, and remind myself that blood means nothing if it's always used to stain you. Ben would see the tightness in my shoulders, press his lips to my temple and say, "They're gone. You're here, that's enough." And it was. Most days. It wasn't until the first Christmas in the new house that I felt the shift deep enough to believe it was real. We dragged in a lopsided tree from the corner shop, lights blinking like tiny stars. Nora came over, arms full of presents she'd wrapped in scraps of brown paper and twine. The neighbor popped in with a tin of burnt mince pies, her kids racing through the hallway, giggling at the echo of their own voices. We ate too much, drank too much, laughed until my ribs ached, and when the last glass was washed and the kids were herded back next door, Ben and I sat on the sofa, our feet tangled under the blanket. Think they'd hate this? He asked, a mischievous spark in his eyes. Absolutely, I said, smiling into my mug. Every second of it. He tilted my chin up, kissed me slow. Then we're doing it right. For the first time in my life, I fell asleep on Christmas night with no fear that I'd wake to shouting or slammed doors or the sting of words that cut deeper than any knife. Just warmth, soft and safe, the world outside our walls silent for once. But the thing about people like my family is that they never really disappear. They linger in the corners of your mind, waiting for you to get too comfortable. I knew it, even as I clung to the peace we'd made here. I knew one day there'd be another letter, another rumor, another crack they'd try to wedge their claws through. So when the knock came on a rainy March morning, it didn't surprise me. It didn't even scare me. I opened the door to find a man in a cheap suit, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. "Marin Calloway?" he asked, flipping through a battered notebook. "That's me," I said. He cleared his throat, shuffling papers. "Your father passed away last night." The world seemed to tilt, not with grief, but with the sick, giddy disbelief that sometimes comes when your worst fear finally burns itself out. "And?" I asked. My voice flat. "There's a will," he said, flinching when I laughed. A raw, ragged sound that startled even me. "Of course there is," I said. "They always have one last trick." Ben appeared behind me, his hand on my shoulder. "What does it say?" The man licked his lips. "He left you everything. The house, what's left of it, his debts, the mess. It's all yours now." I closed my eyes, felt the storm rage for half a heartbeat. And then I opened them, calm as a knife's edge. "I don't want it," I said. "Burn it, sell it, tear it down. I'm not theirs anymore." The man blinked at me like he'd never heard someone walk away from a legacy, no matter how rotten it was. But Ben just squeezed my shoulder, his warmth bleeding through my skin like sunlight through cracks. When the man left, we stood in the doorway, the rain splashing our bare feet. I leaned back against Ben's chest, his breath warm against my ear. "It's really over now," he said. "Not over," I said, smiling at the storm. "Just done." And as the rain washed the world clean around us, I believed it. The rain kept falling after the man left, turning the street into a ribbon of shimmering gray. I stood there on the doorstep with Ben behind me, his arms wrapped around my waist, his chin resting on my shoulder like he was anchoring me to the ground. Maybe he was. Maybe I needed that more than I knew. I should have felt something when I heard the word. Passed away. A father is supposed to mean something. He's supposed to be your protector, your teacher, your shield against the world. But my father had only ever been the monster I checked for behind every door, the shadow I kept trying to outrun. Now he was just gone. Just a signature on a death certificate and a house I didn't want rotting somewhere on the edge of town. I leaned my head back against Ben's shoulder, letting the rain soak into my hair, my skin. "It's so strange," I said. "It's like waiting for thunder that never comes." "That's grief," he said, brushing my damp hair from my cheek. "Or maybe relief. Maybe both." We stayed like that until our clothes clung cold to our skin, until the shivers chased us inside, where the kettle hummed and the house smelled like warm wood and fresh paint instead of stale anger and broken promises. Ben made me tea the way I liked it. Too much sugar, a splash of milk, and set it on the table in front of me. "What now?" he asked, sitting across from me, his hands wrapped around his own mug like he could drink the chill away. "Now?" I traced the rim of my cup with my finger. "Now I make sure whatever he left behind doesn't find a way back to us." It wasn't just the house. It was the debts. The unpaid loans, the favors my father had traded like poker chips at dingy backroom tables. Claudia confirmed it when I called her that afternoon. "It's a mess," she said bluntly. "But you're not responsible for his debts if you disclaim the inheritance. We'll make sure every door stays shut." Nora showed up an hour later, her hair frizzed from the rain, her arms loaded with folders. "You know," she said, dropping them on the kitchen table with a dramatic sigh. "When I signed on as your assistant, I did not expect to become your personal mob deflector. Yet here you are," I said, a tired laugh slipping out. Want tea? God, yes, she said. And then we're going to burn every bridge he tried to build back to you. We spent hours combing through the papers, each line a record of a life built on borrowed time and stolen trust. My father had been thorough in his way, spinning lies so carefully that even now, part of me wanted to believe he'd really cared about something other than himself. But the numbers told the truth. He'd gambled away any chance he had at redemption long before the cancer finally dragged him under. The funeral was small, pitiful even. June called to tell me when it would be, her voice tight with something that might have been judgment or maybe just exhaustion. "You're not coming, are you?" she asked. "No," I said. "I said my goodbye a long time ago." She didn't argue. She just sighed and hung up, leaving me staring at the deadline like it might echo with all the things we'd never say. Ben didn't push me to go either. He knew better than anyone that closure doesn't always look like roses on a grave. Sometimes it's a locked door. Sometimes it's nothing at all. Instead of flowers and eulogies, we spent that day painting the kitchen. Pale yellow, warm, soft, the color of a sunrise you actually wanted to wake up for. We blasted old songs on the radio, our voices off-key but loud enough to drown out the ghost I refused to invite back in. When we finished, we stood in the middle of the room, flecks of paint on our clothes and in my hair, the walls glowing with something that felt like hope. "Do you think he'd hate it?" Ben asked, his grin wicked. "He'd loathe it," I said, laughing so hard I had to lean against the counter. "He'd say it was gaudy and cheap." "Good," Ben said, pressing a kiss to my temple. "Then it's perfect." It wasn't until weeks later that the final piece fell into place. Claudia called one morning while I was weeding the tiny patch of garden we'd managed to wrestle from the brambles. "It's done," she said. "The disclaimers are filed. The debts are on him. You're free, Marin, for real this time." I sat back on my heels, the spring sun warm on my face, the dirt cool under my nails. I looked at the tangled mess of green and brown and felt something bloom in my chest that had nothing to do with roots or flowers. Free. Ben found me there half an hour later, still sitting in the dirt, a silly grin plastered across my face. "You okay?" he asked, crouching down beside me. "Yeah," I said, nodding. "Better than okay?" He glanced at the mess of weeds and half-dug holes. "Garden's gonna look good when you're done." "It's already good," I said, leaning over to kiss him. "Because it's ours." We spent the rest of the day out there, our hands dirty, our knees stained green. We planted wildflowers in the cracks between the old paving stones. We talked about dogs and maybe kids, and the trips we'd take one day when the past felt far enough behind us to dream bigger. And that night, lying in bed with the windows open and the breeze carrying in the scent of new blooms, I felt it for the first time. Peace. Not the fragile kind that shatters when a door slams or a phone rings. The kind that settles in your bones and reminds you that you survived. That you won. When I drifted off, Ben's breath warm against my neck, I dreamed of nothing at all. And I woke up with the sunrise, ready to live in the blank spaces I'd finally made for myself. Spring melted into summer like honey in tea. The house settled around us, each room taking on the shape of our days together. Ben's boots by the door, my books stacked in leaning towers next to the sofa, the scent of fresh paint giving way to something softer, lived in. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night, half expecting to hear a door slam or my father's footsteps thudding down the hall. But the only sound was Ben's steady breathing, the creak of the old walls as they shifted in the warm night air. Freedom wasn't what I'd imagined. It wasn't fireworks or confetti or some grand announcement that the world was finally right again. It was quieter than that. Smaller. It was walking to the corner shop for milk without checking over my shoulder. It was planting tomatoes in the garden, laughing as Ben threatened to name each seedling. It was Nora dropping by with takeaway and gossip about her new crush, her voice echoing off our kitchen walls without a single ghost trying to eavesdrop. One humid afternoon, Ben and I sat on the back step with our feet in the grass, watching the garden bloom in wild, stubborn colors. He had dirt smudged across his cheek, and his hair stuck up in tufts where he'd run his fingers through it for the 100th time. It doesn't feel real sometimes, I said, tearing a leaf from the mint plant and rolling it between my fingers. How quiet it is. Good kind of quiet? He asked, bumping my knee with his. The best kind, I said. Though sometimes I think the quiet makes me remember things I'd rather forget. He was quiet for a moment, the breeze carrying the scent of rosemary and lavender around us. I think that's how you know you're healing. You remember, but it doesn't own you anymore. I looked at him then. This man who'd held my hand when my whole world was on fire, who never once asked me to be less just so I'd fit into someone else's story. You know you saved me, right? His smile was soft, a little sad. No, Marin, you saved yourself. I just stood beside you while you did it. The next morning, I woke to the sound of laughter in the garden. Peeking through the window, I saw Nora sprawled on a picnic blanket, her shoes kicked off, her phone held up like a megaphone as she argued with Ben about which takeaway place had the best samosas. It hit me then. This was family too. Not the kind you're born with, but the kind you find when you finally stop letting your past pick who you're allowed to love. That weekend, the three of us drove out to the coast. I hadn't been back to the sea since Ben and I had run there after the wedding. The first time I'd really felt the weight of what I'd done pressing into my ribs like iron bands. Now the sand felt different under my feet. The wind felt like it belonged to me. Nora talked the entire drive, about her new boyfriend, about her job, about the time she'd caught our old neighbor trying to water his plastic lawn. Ben just grinned, tapping the steering wheel in time with her stories, his eyes catching mine in the mirror every so often like he was reminding me, "You're here, you're safe." We spent the afternoon chasing each other through the shallows, the cold waves soaking our jeans. We sat on the pebbles eating chips that tasted like the salt air, the sun setting behind us in a blaze of pink and gold. I watched Ben laugh with his head thrown back, Nora tossing chips at the gulls like she was the queen of the beach. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like an imposter in my own happiness. When we drove home that night, I dozed in the passenger seat, my head resting against Ben's shoulder as Nora snored in the back seat, her feet propped on the cooler box she'd insisted on bringing. The hum of the road under the tires sounded like a lullaby, each mile carrying me further away from the woman my family had tried to break. That peace didn't mean the past vanished overnight. Some nights I still woke up, gasping from dreams of my father's rage, the echo of my mother's disappointment clinging to my skin like a cold sweat. But when I turned my head, Ben was always there. Sometimes snoring, sometimes already awake, his hand finding mine under the covers like he'd been waiting for the fear to pass. The letters slowed to a trickle. A cousin here, an old neighbor there, people who couldn't stand that I'd stepped out of line. I saved everyone. Not because I needed the reminders, but because each envelope felt like proof that I'd done it. That I'd told the truth so loudly they couldn't drown it out anymore. One afternoon, a lawyer's letter arrived, my mother's final affairs. She'd gone quietly, June wrote in the scrawled note she tucked inside. No grand confessions, no last-minute apologies that would tie me to her memory like a leash. Just silence. For once, the kind that didn't come with a threat. I sat on the porch with that letter in my lap, the dusk creeping in around me. Ben came out with 2 mugs of tea, setting one beside me before sinking down on the step. "What will you do with it?" he asked. I looked at the paper, words and numbers and a signature that didn't feel like mine anymore. "Nothing," I said. "I don't want it. She gave me nothing when she was alive. I won't let her give me something now just to keep her ghost rattling around in my head." He nodded, resting his chin on my shoulder. "Then we'll burn it." And we did. We stood in the garden under the glow of the string lights we'd hung up that spring, the paper curling in the metal bin we used for garden scraps. The flame caught fast, bright and hungry, then gone. Ash drifting up into the dark. Nora came by the next day, her eyes wide when she saw the scorched patch of earth. "Did you two have a bonfire without me?" "Not a bonfire," I said, my voice light. "Just clearing the garden." She didn't push. Just hugged me tight, her warmth pressing into the spaces my mother had left empty. By the time autumn settled in, the house felt entirely ours. No ghosts in the corners. No letters slipped through the mail slot like poison darts. Just us. Just the life we'd fought like hell to carve out of the bones they'd tried to bury me under. Some nights, Ben and I sat on the back step, blankets draped around our shoulders, the garden sleeping under the first frost. We'd talk about the future. Kids, maybe. A bigger garden. Trips we'd take when the world didn't feel so small. "Do you ever wish you'd done it differently?" he asked one night. His breath, a cloud in the cold air. "What?" "All of it. The way you cut them out. The way you fought." I turned to him, the soft glow from the kitchen window lighting the stubble on his jaw, the kindness in his eyes that never once wavered. "No," I said, "because if I'd done it any other way, they'd still own me. They'd still be sitting at this table, telling me who I'm allowed to be." He smiled, his fingers threading through mine. "Good. Because you're exactly who you're supposed to be." I leaned my head on his shoulder, the weight of the past pressed into the ground beneath us, feeding the roots of the life we'd planted together. And for the first time, I didn't just believe I was free. I knew it. Winter came early that year, settling over the city like a hush. The house creaked in the cold, its old bones shifting under the weight of frost and wind. But inside, it was warm. Ben and I layered blankets over the sofa, mugs of tea steaming in our hands while we watched the snow drift past the window, a silent reminder that even the world needed to rest sometimes. I liked the way the house sounded in winter, the soft pop of the radiators, the tick of the old clock on the mantel, the way our laughter echoed off the walls we'd painted together. Sometimes I caught myself tracing my fingers along the cracks in the plaster, tiny reminders that you can fix the damage, but you never forget it's there. It didn't scare me anymore. If anything, it made me love these walls more. They'd held our secrets, our scars, our victories. Nora visited nearly every weekend, wrapped in her oversized scarf, cheeks pink from the cold. She'd kick off her boots at the door, stomp snow onto the mat, and plop down on the sofa like she owned the place. "Marry me, Ben," she teased one Saturday when he brought in a tray of fresh scones. "You bake like a dream. I promise I'd treat you right." He just rolled his eyes, dropping the tray on the coffee table with a grin. "Sorry, Nora, I'm taken. Find your own pastry chef." She winked at me. "Fine, but I'm stealing him if you ever mess up." It was these moments that made the silence of my old family seem so far away, like a life I'd read about in a book but could no longer feel on my skin. The old fears still whispered sometimes. A letter in the mail, a rumor from an old neighbor that made its way to my phone. But they didn't land the same way anymore. They didn't dig their claws in. I'd done the work, burned the bridges, locked the doors, salted the earth where my ghosts had once grown. One evening, a knock came at the door just after dinner. Ben looked up from the sink, his hands buried in suds, while I dried the plates. "Expecting someone?" he asked. "No one who knocks this politely," I said. It was June, standing on the front step with her hat clutched in her gloved hands. She looked smaller than I remembered. Older, the lines in her face etched deeper by years of worry I'd stopped shouldering for her. "Hi, Marin," she said, her voice brittle with the cold. "Can I come in?" I didn't owe her anything, but I stepped aside anyway. Old habits die hard. She stood just inside the hallway, her eyes sweeping the walls, the photos of Ben and me, the framed shot of Nora holding up a bottle of Prosecco like a trophy the night we'd closed on the house. "It's nice here," June said. "Warm." "It is," I said, crossing my arms. "Why are you here, June?" She hesitated, twisting her hat until the fabric looked ready to tear. "I wanted to tell you I'm leaving. Moving to Scotland. Closer to my son. He's got kids now, you know. Little ones." I nodded. "I know." She looked at me then, her eyes wet, her mouth trembling around words she'd probably rehearsed 100 times. "I didn't come to ask you for anything. I wanted you to know I'm proud of you. I know I didn't help you the way I should have. I let them hurt you, I'm sorry." It didn't hit me like a wave. There was no tidal rush of forgiveness, no sudden softening of old wounds, just a gentle release, like an exhale I'd been holding for too long. "Thank you," I said, and I meant it. It didn't change the past. But it didn't have to. She pulled me into a hug. Awkward, stiff, but real in its own way. Then she left, her footprints trailing through the snow on our walkway. I stood there for a long time, the cold creeping into my bones, watching until her shadow melted into the night. Ben came up behind me, pressing his hands to my shoulders. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said. "I think I am." Winter bled into spring. We planted new flowers in the garden, filled the windowsills with herbs that made the kitchen smell like summer even when the wind still bit our cheeks red. Nora started dating a man who cooked like Ben did. And every time she came over, she brought leftovers that tasted like hope and new beginnings. Sometimes I'd catch Ben watching me while I worked in the garden, dirt under my nails, hair tied back, my face tilted up to the sun. "What?" I'd ask, laughing when he didn't look away. He'd just shake his head, grinning like he was seeing me for the first time all over again. "Nothing," he'd say. "Just I love you, Marin. I love this life we built." I loved it too. I loved the cracks in our plaster, the squeak in the floorboards, the old fence that leaned a little more every time the wind blew hard. I loved the people we'd chosen. Nora, our neighbor's noisy kids, the shopkeeper who slipped extra pastries into our bag because he liked the way Ben always made him laugh. And I loved the way the world felt when I woke up each morning. Lighter, cleaner, mine. One evening, as we sat on the back step, watching the stars prick through the dark, Ben slipped his hand into mine. "Do you ever think about what you'd tell her? If you could," he asked. "My mother?" He nodded. I looked up at the sky, the constellations swirling like a map I'd never learned how to read. I'd tell her she was wrong about me, that she didn't break me the way she thought she did, that I made something beautiful out of all the ugly parts she left behind. I felt him smile against my temple. "She'd hate that." "I know," I said. "That's why I'd say it." We sat there until the air turned too cold for our bare feet, the garden quiet except for the whisper of the wind through the trees we'd planted ourselves. And when we went inside, closing the door behind us, I knew, really knew, that no one could touch this. Not the family that had tried to break me, not the shadows they'd left behind, not even the parts of myself that still trembled in the dark. We'd won. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.